African Union is holding an important summit. The US President Joe Biden has sent his best wishes for the summit after making an important speech yesterday in which he promised to change US foreign policy. In some ways, it will be a big shift from the policies of the former President Donald Trump. Biden says he will stand up to Russia and China. Seems to be changing course relating to our continent, but perhaps the most important change in the shorter term is that he will withdraw US support for the Saudi Arabian bombing campaign in Yemen, conflict which has killed hundreds of thousands of people. Professor Robert Shear is an emeritus professor of politics at UCT. Professor, good afternoon. Thank you for your time today. In some ways, it's not just about the substantive changes that Biden is making, but he seems to be wanting to set an important tone for how his country will conduct its international relations.
I think you're correct. Everything is a reaction to one's predecessor. And with Trump, obviously, this was live television. This was entertainment. This was amateur hour. And it was policy by tweet, suddenly making decisions out of the chain of command with very little thought. It was basically what I call the auto-cannibalism of America, in which America devoured itself, destroyed its alliances, basically destroyed most of what it stood for. And I think what Biden is trying to stress is that, if you will, the grown-ups are back. The professionals are now taking back control of foreign policy. And it's interesting that it was held at the State Department, that he was, in fact, welcoming new members, new recruits. So basically, Biden was saying the grown-ups are back. American foreign policy is going back to a professional undertaking.
The situation in Yemen, I mean, it really is a catastrophe. It's driven really to a large extent by the Saudi bombing campaign. They used, as I understand it, American planes and I presume bombs to do that. How important is Biden's announcement that the US will no longer support that campaign?
It's a very important statement in two ways. First of all, it sends a message that America is not going to support any tin pot or otherwise dictator, as Salman is in Saudi Arabia. But more important, if you look into the operation, it wasn't simply a question of Americans providing aid. The Saudis were actually not allowed to operate most of the high-tech communications and censoring devices. So in fact, the operation was done by Americans within Saudi Arabia. So if the Americans pull out, the Saudis cannot replace them. So it was more than simply support. If you will, the Americans were operating the Saudi system of bombing.
What's really important, I mean, in a way, is Russia. Now, for years, American presidents have often won support by being seen to be strong against Russia. I mean, there's a famous quote from Ronald Reagan, Secretary Gorbachev, tear down this wall, talking about the Berlin Wall, and eventually the wall did come down. I mean, one of the ways to success was to have a muscular stance towards Russia. Trump was completely different. An aberration, seemed to play sometimes footsie, but certainly softly with Vladimir Putin. Again, Biden is going back to more traditional policy.
It's I think there are many elements of Trump's governance that remain mysterious. One of them, and perhaps one of the most interesting, is his policy towards Russia, because it made no sense from America's interests nor from Trump's own interests. There was, whether it was simply his idiosyncratic respect for strong men, and we know that Trump, as a weakling, loved what he saw as tough, strong people like Xi and Putin and Erdogan, or whether there's something more sinister in terms of various conspiracies that Trump was in the pay or blackmailed or whatever. But the bottom line is Trump gave Putin a free pass. And what Biden is doing is reasserting the American traditional view that Russia is not playing a status quo role. They are not being good citizens. They are intervening in America's cyber situation, the elections, more importantly in the Middle East, in Syria, and in Libya. And that America is no longer going to give Russia a free pass.
In a way, I mean, Russia's important, but probably his presidency in terms of foreign policy will be defined by China. There was the famous pivot towards China during the Obama years. How do you see Biden managing this? And I mean, Beijing, China, stronger now than it has been really in the modern era, growing in strength, growing in military strength, and coming out of the pandemic era, if I can call it that. I mean, Beijing is possibly stronger than it's ever been. It's able to have its way in Hong Kong, for example.
One of the critical weaknesses of Trump is that he occasionally correctly isolated a problem. He would break away perhaps from a consensus which had passed its sell-by date. The prevailing view, perhaps 10, 15 years ago, was that as China developed, it would become a good citizen, play by the rules, and not be a threat to the status quo. Clearly, this didn't happen, this optimistic scenario. So Trump, in a sense, was correct to recognize the problem, but he went about it in completely the wrong way, in a counterproductive way. First of all, he did it America alone. And I think one thing that Biden will introduce is allies. One of the most important assets which America and the West have is that they have allies. If you look at the point of view from China, which countries in the world could we confidently say in 10 years' time will be allies of China? And there are very few. Zimbabwe, Pakistan, possibly, but probably not Russia. Where are America's allies? Virtually the rest of the world, the European Union, Canada, Australia, and so on. So one of the critical errors that Trump made was, on the one hand, to focus on China as a problem, but secondly, to attack its allies. Trump attacked the Australians, he attacked the Europeans, he attacked Canada. So what Biden will definitely do is make this an alliance approach. And we've already seen he's talking of a conference of Democrats, a constellation of Democrats. He's going to work with all of the other powers, and that will make it far more effective. Secondly, Trump had a kind of scattershot approach. He had put tariffs and quotas on Chinese products. He tried to force them to buy American products, and we know that's the wrong way to approach it. Tariffs do not help America, and they in fact do not hurt China. So we can expect from Biden a more focused approach, if you will, a professional approach, a cost-benefit approach in which America works out what are the appropriate tools that they have to deal with China, and then trying to get a consensus within the Western countries. So certainly it will be a lot more focused and more effective than Trump's, I think, disastrous handling of foreign policy.
Do you expect Beijing to change tack? I mean, clearly they've been moving in a more nationalistic direction. President Xi is incredibly powerful now. Perhaps one of the most important developments over the last 10 years there has been the fact that there is now no limit on how long he can stay in power. There used to be a sort of rule in China, if I've understood their politics correctly, that no one could stay in charge of the country for more than 10 years. That's been removed. Do you expect Beijing to change tack?
No, I think one of the factors that we need to keep in mind is that government is really a machine for solving problems that the society demands. In other words, problems that individuals can't help. And one of the realities is that, like the army, the Chinese model is much more effective than the Western model for certain kinds of challenges. For example, if we look at, let us say, an army, and we look at a hippie community, and there is a pandemic, which community is going to be more effective, the army or the hippie village? And the obvious answer is the army. So the Chinese system failed because it didn't recognize early the nature of the pandemic. And this is an advantage which I think a democratic country would have been more quick to recognize the problem. But where China had the advantage is, like the army, they could take complete authoritarian control. They could shut down Wuhan. They could keep factories going at the same time. They could demand that people remain in their houses. Just look in this country, the United States, a basic thing like wearing masks becomes a political football, despite the overwhelming evidence of science. So the bottom line is that the Chinese system, very effective at playing the military role, being authoritarian, directing people to do things, not that effective when it comes to recognizing problems. So certainly the Chinese system has been at its very best. It has been enormously effective. But of course, most situations are not pandemics. And I think we will see the pendulum swing towards the West when it comes to becoming more creative, getting the economy to become more vigorous. So Xi staying indefinitely has advantages. It means you don't have the Trumps and then the Bidens kind of interludes. But as we saw from Mao, the longer people stay in office, the more idiosyncratic and the more likely they are to make mistakes. And the reality in China, for better and for worse, is that there is nobody who can tell Xi when he is right and when he is wrong.
Professor Robert Shearer, I do appreciate it. Emeritus Professor of Politics at the University of Cape Town. Thank you very much.